My husband stood up at our anniversary dinner, raised his glass, and introduced another woman as his wife while I was still sitting right there at the same table, smiling at our guests like nothing was wrong. I could feel every pair of eyes slowly turning toward me, waiting for me to react, waiting for me to break, but I didn't move, not even when his mother gave me that quiet, knowing look like she had been expecting this moment all along. My fingers tightened around the stem of my wine glass, the cold glass pressing into my skin, and for a second, I thought my heart might actually stop. But I kept smiling because they didn't know what I had already done that morning, and they definitely didn't know what was about to happen next. If you've ever sat in silence while your whole world collapsed in front of people who were supposed to be your family, then just stay with me. And only if this story truly resonates with you, take a moment to like, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there right now, because I always wonder who is listening to stories like mine in the middle of their own nights. My name is Olivia Carter. I'm 32 years old, and this was the night my marriage ended in front of everyone, even though the truth is, it had already been over long before that dinner. It started 3 months earlier, on a Tuesday afternoon that felt so ordinary I almost missed it. I remember the exact time because I glanced at the kitchen clock while waiting for the coffee machine to finish brewing. 2:17 p.m., and the house was quiet, the kind of quiet that usually felt peaceful, but that day felt off. Daniel had left his phone on the counter, something he never did, and it lit up with a message while I was standing there. Just one line that stayed on the screen long enough for me to read it without even trying. "Dinner tonight? I miss you already." And for a second, I told myself it had to be work. Maybe a client, maybe something harmless, but something in my chest tightened in a way I couldn't explain. I didn't pick up the phone right away. I just stood there, listening to the soft drip of the coffee machine, watching the notification fade, and then I reached for it slowly, like touching it would somehow confirm something I wasn't ready to face. The message was from a name I didn't recognize, Sophie, and when I opened the thread, there were weeks of conversations, late-night messages, plans, jokes, things that felt too familiar, too intimate, like I was reading pieces of a life that didn't belong to me. I didn't cry, not then. I just stood there in the kitchen, staring at the screen while my coffee went cold. And I remember thinking, this doesn't make sense, this isn't real. But at the same time, another part of me already knew it was. When Daniel came home that evening, he acted exactly the same. Same smile, same casual, hey, as if nothing had changed, as if my entire world hadn't just shifted a few inches off its axis, and I watched him carefully, noticing things I had never noticed before, the way he avoided eye contact for a second too long, the way he checked his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. I didn't say anything. Not that night, not the next day, not even the week after that, because something inside me had already started to change, something quieter, colder, more deliberate. Instead of confronting him, I started paying attention. Small things at first, his schedule, the nights he said he had meetings, the receipts in his jacket pocket, and every piece fit together in a way I couldn't ignore anymore. But what hurt the most wasn't just the betrayal. It was the way everything else around it started to make sense. The distance, the late nights, the subtle shift in how he spoke to me, like I had already been replaced long before I even knew it. Still, I didn't react. I didn't argue, I didn't cry in front of him, because somewhere in the middle of all that quiet observation, I made a decision, one that no one else saw coming. I remember sitting in my car outside a law office 2 weeks later, my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at the glass doors, telling myself if I walked in, there was no going back. And for a moment, I hesitated, not because I doubted what I had seen, but because of everything I was about to let go of. 10 years of marriage? A home, a life that from the outside looked stable and complete. But then I thought about that message again, about the way he had looked at me like nothing had changed, and I opened the door and stepped out of the car. What happened inside that office was calm, almost too calm. Paperwork, signatures, quiet conversations, the kind of process that doesn't feel dramatic at all but changes everything. The lawyer explained things clearly, assets, accounts, ownership, and I listened carefully, asking questions I never thought I'd have to ask, making decisions I never thought I'd have to make. And when I finally signed the documents, My hand didn't shake, not even a little, because by that point, something inside me had already settled into place. But they didn't know any of this. Not Daniel, not his family, not anyone sitting at that dinner table 3 months later, watching him stand there with that confident smile, introducing another woman as his wife, thinking he was in control of everything, thinking I was still the same person who would sit there and accept it. What they didn't know was that by the time that dinner even started, everything had already shifted, and what happened next was never part of his plan. Daniel kept talking like nothing was wrong, like the air in the room had not just shifted, like I was not sitting 3 feet away from him while he rested his hand lightly on Sophie's back, as if it belonged there, and I noticed how natural it looked to him, how practiced, which meant this was not new, not sudden, not a mistake. The restaurant lights reflected softly off the glasses and polished wood, and somewhere behind us a server dropped a fork, the sharp sound cutting through the silence for just a second before everything went quiet again. Too quiet, the kind of silence where people pretend to keep eating but are actually listening to every word. I lifted my glass slowly, not to drink, just to have something steady in my hand, and I could feel my pulse against the stem, fast but controlled, and I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment he thought would break me. Sophie sat beside him, smiling politely at the table, but her eyes moved quickly, scanning faces, trying to read the room, and for a brief second our eyes met, and there was something there, not guilt exactly, but uncertainty, like she was not as sure about this situation as Daniel was. His mother, Margaret, leaned slightly towards Sophie and said something under her breath, a small approving smile forming on her lips, and that told me everything I needed to know. This was not just his decision. This had been accepted, maybe even encouraged. I set my glass down carefully, the soft sound barely noticeable, and I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, at the man I had spent 10 years building a life with, and I realized something I had not fully admitted to myself before. He genuinely believed he was winning. "You should say something," he said finally, his tone calm but edged with expectation, like he was giving me a chance to respond before moving forward with whatever came next. A few people shifted in their seats. Forks paused mid-air. Conversations at nearby tables faded into the background, and I could feel the weight of attention pressing in from every direction. But I did not rush. I did not react the way they expected. Instead, I folded my hands lightly on the table and asked, "Is this how you wanted to do it?" My voice steady, almost too calm. And that was the first moment something flickered across his face, just a brief hesitation, like he had expected anger, tears, anything louder than that. "I think it is better to be honest," he replied, straightening slightly, slipping back into that confident tone. "There is no reason to drag things out." And I nodded slowly, as if I was considering his words, even though I had already heard everything I needed to hear months ago. What he did not know was that I had already mapped this moment in my head more times than I could count, every possible variation, every possible reaction, and I had chosen this one: silence first, then control. I reached for the folded document he had just slid across the table toward me, the divorce papers he thought would corner me, and I picked it up, not rushing, letting the paper unfold slowly under my fingers, and I glanced at the first page without really reading it, because I did not need to. The room stayed quiet, waiting, and I could hear someone at the far end of the table whisper something that ended in a soft, awkward laugh that quickly disappeared. I closed the document again and placed it back down in front of me, aligning it neatly with the edge of the table, a small, precise movement that felt louder than anything I could have said. "You want me to sign this now?" I said, not a question, just a statement, and Daniel nodded once, relieved, like things were finally going according to his plan. "It is easier this way," he added, and I noticed how he did not look directly at me when he said it, his gaze shifting briefly toward Sophie, toward his mother, like he needed their presence to hold his confidence in place. I let a small breath out, barely noticeable, and for a moment I looked around the table, at both families, at people who had watched our relationship from the outside and assumed they understood it, and I wondered how many of them had known, how many had chosen not to say anything, but I did not ask, because it did not matter anymore. "Are you sure?" I asked, and this time I looked straight at him, holding his gaze long enough that the question landed differently than it sounded. There was a pause, just half a second, but it was enough, I saw it, that flicker again, uncertainty, quickly covered by a slight smile. "Yes," he said, more firmly now, as if convincing himself as much as me. I nodded once, then reached into my bag slowly, deliberately, feeling the smooth leather under my fingers as I opened it, and for the first time that night, a few people leaned forward slightly, attention sharpening, curiosity replacing judgment. I pulled out a single envelope, clean, unmarked, and placed it gently on the table beside his documents, not sliding it toward him yet, just letting it sit there between us. Daniel frowned slightly, his brows pulling together as he looked at it, and I could almost hear the shift in his thoughts. This was not part of his plan. "What is that?" he asked, and his voice had lost just a fraction of its earlier confidence. I did not answer immediately. I let the silence stretch, just long enough for everyone at the table to feel it, for the weight of the moment to settle in a different way. Then I pushed the envelope toward him, slow, controlled, stopping it right in front of his hand. "You should read it," I said softly. And as his fingers touched the edge of the envelope, I leaned back slightly in my chair for the first time that night, not retreating, just creating space. Because what he was about to see was something he had never considered, something he had never prepared for, and as he opened it, as his eyes moved across the first page, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. And in that moment, before anyone said a word, before anyone fully understood, everything had already changed. Daniel's eyes moved slowly across the page, and at first nothing happened, no reaction, no sudden shift, just that same controlled expression he always wore in public. But I saw it, the exact second it changed, the way his jaw tightened slightly, the way his fingers pressed harder against the paper like he needed something solid to hold on to. The room stayed completely still, no one speaking, no one interrupting, and even the background noise from the restaurant seemed to fade, like everything had narrowed down to that one moment, that one page in his hands. "What is this?" he asked, but his voice sounded different now, lower, less certain, and he looked up at me like he was expecting an explanation that would somehow undo what he was already reading. I did not answer right away. I just met his gaze calmly, letting him sit with it for a second longer, because I knew he had not reached the part that mattered yet. Sophie leaned slightly closer to him, trying to read over his shoulder, her earlier confidence gone, replaced with something more cautious, and Margaret's expression shifted too, the faint smile disappearing, as she tried to understand what was happening without asking directly. Daniel looked back down at the document, flipping to the next page faster this time, his movements less controlled, more urgent, and I could see the realization starting to form. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to unsettle him. "This does not make sense," he said, almost to himself, and that was the first time all night he did not sound in control. I tilted my head slightly, resting my hand lightly on the table, and said, "It will." My voice quiet, steady, and that made him look up again, sharper this time, searching my face for something he had clearly missed. One of his brothers shifted in his seat, glancing between us, and someone across the table whispered something that quickly died off when no one responded. Daniel turned another page, and this time his hand paused halfway through, his eyes scanning the lines more carefully, slower now, and I knew he had reached it. The section that connected everything, the part he never thought to question before. "You filed," he started, but stopped, like saying it out loud would make it more real, and I nodded once, not interrupting, not rushing him, just confirming what he was already beginning to understand. "This morning," I said, and the words landed heavier than anything else that had been said that night. There was a small, collective intake of breath around the table, subtle but noticeable, the kind of reaction people have when something shifts from uncomfortable to undeniable. Sophie straightened in her chair, pulling her hand away from Daniel's arm almost instinctively, as if the connection suddenly felt uncertain, and Margaret's posture stiffened, her eyes narrowing slightly as she recalculated everything she thought she knew about the situation. "That is not possible," Daniel said quickly, too quickly, like he needed to reject it before fully processing it. "We did not discuss this," and I almost smiled at that, not out of humor, but because of how predictable it sounded. "We did not discuss a lot of things," I replied, my tone still calm, not sharp, not emotional, just factual, and that seemed to unsettle him more than anything else. He looked back down at the document again, flipping to the final pages, scanning signatures, dates, official stamps, all the details he had overlooked when he assumed he was the one leading this conversation. "You cannot just," he started again, but his voice trailed off as he read further, and this time he did not finish the sentence. I leaned back slightly in my chair, folding my hands in my lap, giving him space to process, because this was the part that could not be rushed, the moment where understanding turned into consequence. Across the table, his father cleared his throat softly, a small, uncertain sound that broke the silence for just a second, but no one spoke. No one stepped in, because no one fully understood the situation yet, not completely. "What does this mean?" Sophie asked quietly, her voice careful, directed more at Daniel than at me, and that was when he hesitated, really hesitated, because he did not have an answer. His eyes flicked between the document and my face, then back again, as if hoping something would change if he looked enough times. I watched him closely, noticing the small details, the way his shoulders were no longer relaxed, the way his breathing had shifted, slightly faster, less controlled, and I realized this was the first time all night he was reacting instead of directing. "It means," I said finally, breaking the silence, "that everything you thought you were deciding tonight was already decided." And I let the words settle before continuing. "Just not by you." Another pause followed, heavier this time, and I could feel the attention in the room shift again, no longer waiting for my reaction, but trying to understand his. Daniel's grip on the paper tightened, then loosened, like he was trying to steady himself, and for a moment, he looked around the table, as if searching for support, for someone to step in and restore the balance he had lost, but no one did. Margaret opened her mouth slightly, then closed it again, her usual confidence gone, replaced with uncertainty, and Sophie leaned back just a fraction, creating a small but noticeable distance between herself and Daniel. "You should have told me," he said finally, but the words sounded weak, almost hollow, and I shook my head gently. "I did not need to," I replied, and I held his gaze, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with a kind of quiet finality. He looked down at the document one more time, slower now, as if hoping he had misread something, as if there was still a detail that could change everything, but there was not. And as that realization settled in, the room did not just feel silent anymore. It felt still, like everything had paused at the exact moment his control slipped away. And in that stillness, without raising my voice, without making a scene, I knew something had shifted permanently, something that no one at that table could ignore anymore. No one spoke for a few seconds after my last words, but the silence did not feel the same anymore. It was heavier now, sharper, like everyone in the room had just realized they were no longer watching a situation unfold, they were watching it collapse. Daniel lowered the document slowly onto the table, but his hand did not fully let go of it, his fingers still resting on the edge, as if he needed to keep contact with something that made sense, something that still felt familiar. But there was nothing left in that moment that belonged to him the way he thought it did. "You went behind my back," he said, and this time there was something else in his voice, not anger exactly, but something closer to disbelief, like he could not reconcile the version of me he thought he knew with the person sitting across from him now. I tilted my head slightly, considering his words, and then I answered, "No, Daniel." I caught up, and I did not raise my voice. I did not lean forward. I just let the words sit there, simple, direct, impossible to misinterpret. Sophie shifted again in her seat, this time pulling her chair back just an inch, a small movement but enough to create space, and she glanced toward Margaret as if looking for reassurance. But Margaret did not offer any, her eyes fixed on the papers in front of Daniel, her expression tight, calculating, already trying to understand what this meant for her son, for their family. "This is not final," Daniel said quickly, his posture straightening again, as if he was trying to rebuild the confidence he had lost. "We can still—" But he stopped himself mid-sentence, because even he did not know how to finish it, and that was the moment I saw it clearly. He had never prepared for resistance, only for compliance. I rested my hands lightly on the table, my fingers relaxed now, no longer gripping anything, and I said, "It is already processed," and I watched as the words landed, not dramatically, not loudly, but with a kind of quiet certainty that did not leave room for argument. One of his cousins leaned forward slightly, whispering to the person next to him, but the whisper carried just enough for others to hear, fragments of confusion, of surprise, and the atmosphere shifted again, no longer focused on me as the one being judged, but on him as the one losing control. Daniel shook his head once, like he was trying to clear it, and he picked up the document again, flipping through the pages more quickly now, scanning for something he could challenge, something he could hold on to, but every line led to the same conclusion. "You cannot just take everything," he said, and this time there was a hint of urgency, and I noticed how his voice dropped slightly, like he did not want everyone else to hear the full weight of that realization. I looked at him for a moment, really looked, and then I said, "I did not take anything that was not already mine," and I let that settle, because it was not just about the legal details. It was about everything that had been overlooked for years, everything that had been dismissed, minimized, assumed. His father shifted in his chair, clearing his throat again, this time louder, and he finally spoke. "What exactly is going on here?" His tone measured, trying to regain some sense of authority in a situation that had clearly moved beyond his control, and Daniel opened his mouth to answer, but no words came out right away. Just a pause, long enough to show that he did not have a simple explanation. I turned slightly toward his father, acknowledging the question, and said, "The divorce was filed this morning, and the asset distribution was already agreed upon," keeping my tone calm, factual, not defensive, and that only seemed to deepen the confusion at the table. "Agreed upon?" Margaret repeated, her voice sharper now, and I nodded once. "Signed," I said, and I watched as that word landed differently, heavier, more precise. Daniel's head snapped toward me. "I did not sign anything like this," he said quickly, and I held his gaze, not challenging him, just letting the moment stretch long enough for the realization to catch up. "You signed everything that was put in front of you," I replied, and I did not need to explain further, not yet, because I could see it happening, the memory forming in his mind, the meetings, the documents, the moments he had not paid attention to because he trusted his own assumptions more than the details. Sophie looked at him now, not at me, her expression uncertain, searching, and she asked quietly, "Daniel, what does that mean?" And he did not answer her right away because he was still trying to answer it for himself. The table felt different now, no longer a place where I was being exposed, but a place where everything he had set up was unraveling piece by piece, in front of the same people he had wanted to impress. I reached for my glass again, this time actually taking a small sip, the cool liquid steadying, grounding, and I placed it back down with the same controlled movement as before. "You said you wanted honesty," I added, looking at him, and there was no edge in my voice, no bitterness, just a quiet reflection of his own words, and that seemed to hit harder than anything else. He looked at me then, really looked, and for the first time that night, there was no confidence left in his expression, only the beginning of something else, something closer to understanding, and maybe, just for a second, regret. But I did not move toward that. I did not soften, because this was not about emotion anymore. It was about consequence. And as the room sat in that stillness, with every detail now exposed, I knew that whatever came next would not be something he could control or rewrite, not this time. Daniel stared at me like he was seeing a version of me he had never met before, and for a moment he said nothing, just held that look, trying to piece together how everything had shifted without him noticing, and I could almost hear the thoughts behind his silence, going back through conversations, documents, moments he had dismissed because they did not seem important at the time. "When?" he finally asked, his voice quieter now, less demanding, more searching, and I did not rush to answer. I let the question sit there, because the truth was not just a single moment, it was a series of choices, small decisions that built into something he could no longer undo. Over the last few weeks, I said simply, and that was enough to make him look down again, his mind trying to match that timeline with everything he thought he knew. Sophie shifted again, this time pulling her hands into her lap, her earlier composure replaced by a careful stillness. And she looked at Daniel like she was waiting for him to explain, to fix it, to take control of the situation the way he had just minutes ago. But he did not move, did not reassure her, did not even look at her right away. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her voice lower now, controlled but tense. "What exactly did you sign?" And that question hung in the air longer than any other, because it forced him to confront something he had clearly avoided. Daniel exhaled slowly, running a hand through his hair, a gesture I had seen countless times before when he was frustrated. But this time it looked different, less confident, more uncertain, and he did not answer immediately, which was answer enough. I watched him carefully, not with anger, not with satisfaction, just with a kind of distance that I had not felt before tonight, and I realized that the version of him sitting across from me now was not the one I had been married to for 10 years. Or maybe it was, and I had just not seen it clearly until now. "You trusted me," I said quietly, and he looked up at that, his expression tightening. "You trusted me to handle everything," and I paused just long enough for the meaning to settle, "and you stopped paying attention," and there was no accusation in my tone, just a statement of fact, and that seemed to hit him harder than if I had raised my voice. His father leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms slowly, his expression thoughtful now, no longer trying to control the situation, but trying to understand it. And one of Daniel's cousins let out a quiet breath, almost a laugh, but caught it halfway, turning it into a cough instead. Sophie finally spoke again, her voice careful. "So, what happens now?" And the question felt different from before, less about curiosity and more about consequence. And Daniel did not answer her this time either, because he was still trying to understand the answer himself. I glanced at her briefly, then back at him, and I said, "Now everything continues." And I saw the confusion in her face, so I added, "Just without him having control over it." And that was when it became clear to everyone at the table that this was not just about the divorce, it was about everything connected to it. Daniel's hand tightened slightly on the edge of the table, and he leaned forward just a fraction, lowering his voice. "You planned this," he said, and I held his gaze, not denying it, not confirming it outright, just letting the silence answer for me, and that silence said more than any explanation could have. "You could have talked to me," he added, and there was something almost familiar in that line, something I had heard before in different forms, at different times, whenever something went wrong, whenever accountability shifted just enough to avoid being fully faced. I nodded once, acknowledging the statement without agreeing to it, and I said, "I did talk to you." And I let that sit there, because we both knew it was true. Conversations he had dismissed, concerns he had minimized, moments he had chosen not to engage with because they were inconvenient. His eyes flickered again, just briefly. And I knew he remembered, even if he did not want to admit it out loud. The table had grown even quieter now, not because people were waiting for something dramatic, but because they were realizing that the dramatic part had already happened, and what remained was the reality settling in. Margaret sat back slowly, her posture rigid, her expression controlled again, but different, less certain, and she looked at Daniel with a question she did not ask out loud, one that did not need words anymore. Sophie's shoulders lowered slightly, the tension in her posture easing not because the situation was resolved, but because she understood that she was no longer part of something stable, something predictable, and that realization created distance, even without her moving. Daniel looked down at the documents one more time, then back at me, and for the first time that night, he did not speak right away. He just looked, as if trying to find something in my expression that would give him an opening, a way to shift things back. But there was nothing there for him to use, nothing to negotiate, nothing to redirect. I reached for my bag again, closing it calmly, the soft click of the clasp sounding louder than it should have in the quiet room, and I placed it beside my chair, a small, ordinary action that marked a transition more clearly than any words could have. "This does not have to be like this," he said finally, and I paused for a moment, considering the sentence, not because I believed it, but because of how late it had come. I looked at him, steady, and replied, "It already is," and there was no anger in it, no bitterness, just a quiet certainty that did not leave room for anything else. And as I said it, I could feel something settle inside me, something that had been building for months, finally reaching its endpoint, not with noise, not with confrontation, but with clarity. And in that clarity, I understood that whatever happened next would not change what had already been set in motion. Not tonight, not anymore. For a moment, no one moved, and I could feel it, that shift in the room settling into something final, something that no one could pretend was temporary anymore. Daniel looked at me like he was about to say something else, something that might change the direction of everything, but the words never came. They just stayed there, unfinished, like he was realizing that whatever he said now would not have the same effect it used to. I reached for my chair and pushed it back slowly, the soft scrape against the floor cutting through the silence in a way that made a few heads turn, not because it was loud, but because it meant something was ending. I stood up, smoothing my dress with a small, automatic motion, the kind you do without thinking, and for the first time that night, I was not reacting. I was deciding. "You are leaving?" Margaret asked, her voice tight, controlled, as if she was trying to regain some authority over a situation that had already slipped beyond her reach, and I turned my head slightly toward her, meeting her gaze just long enough to acknowledge the question. "I already did," I said quietly, and there was a pause after that, a longer one this time, because the meaning of those words extended beyond the room, beyond the dinner, beyond everything they had just witnessed. Daniel pushed his chair back suddenly, standing up as well, his movement sharper, less controlled than anything he had done earlier, and for a second it looked like he was going to follow me, to stop me. But he hesitated, just long enough for the moment to pass. "Olivia, wait," he said, and there was something in his voice now that had not been there before, something closer to urgency, but not quite enough to undo what had already happened. I paused, but I did not turn around immediately. I just stood there, my hand resting lightly on the back of the chair, giving him a moment, not because I owed him that, but because I wanted to hear what he thought was left to say. "We need to talk about this," he continued, and I let out a small breath, almost a quiet exhale of recognition, because that sentence, that exact sentence, had been said before, in different contexts, at different times, always when something had already gone wrong. I turned back slowly, looking at him, really looking this time, not at the version of him I had once trusted, but at the man standing in front of me now, trying to recover something he no longer understood. "We had time to talk," I said, my voice calm, not raised, not sharp, just steady, and that seemed to land heavier than if I had said it with anger. Sophie remained seated, her hands folded in front of her, watching the exchange quietly, and for the first time since the dinner began, she did not look like she belonged at that table. She looked like someone who had stepped into a situation without fully understanding it, and was now realizing the ground beneath her was not as solid as she thought. Daniel took a step toward me, then stopped again, like he was unsure how close he was allowed to get, unsure of the space between us in a way he had never questioned before. "This is not how it is supposed to end," he said, and I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because it was honest, in a way he probably did not intend. Because for him, this was not how it was supposed to go, not how he had planned it, not how he had imagined this night would unfold. "It is not ending," I replied, and I held his gaze as I said it. "It just changed." And there was something in that distinction that made him pause again, like he was trying to understand what that meant beyond the surface. His father shifted in his chair behind him, watching quietly now, no longer interrupting, no longer asking questions, just observing. And I could feel the attention of the entire table on us, not with the same judgment as before, but with something closer to realization. I picked up my bag from beside the chair, the weight of it familiar in my hand, grounding, and I adjusted the strap over my shoulder, a small, simple movement that felt like the most natural thing I had done all night. "You cannot just walk away," Daniel said, and this time there was a trace of frustration in his voice, not directed outward, but inward, like he was confronting the fact that he no longer had the ability to stop me. I tilted my head slightly, considering his words, and then I said, "I am not walking away," and I paused just long enough for him to focus on what I was about to say next. "I am moving forward." And there was a difference there, one he could hear even if he did not fully understand it yet. The room stayed quiet, no one interrupting, no one stepping in, because at this point, there was nothing left to mediate, nothing left to smooth over. Sophie looked down at the table, her fingers tracing lightly along the edge of her glass, and Margaret leaned back slowly in her chair, her expression set, but no longer certain, and I realized that whatever image they had built of me over the years, whatever assumptions they had made, they were all being replaced in real time by something else. Daniel opened his mouth again, but then stopped, the words catching before they could form, and for a second, I saw it, the exact moment he understood that there was no version of this conversation where he regained control, no version where things returned to how they were before. I nodded once, not as agreement, not as permission, just as acknowledgement. And then I turned away, taking a step toward the exit, my heels soft against the floor, steady, measured, and with each step, the distance between us became more real, more permanent. No one called out this time, no one tried to stop me, and as I reached the edge of the room, I felt something shift inside me, not a release exactly, but a quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to be announced or explained. Behind me, the room remained still, suspended in the aftermath of everything that had just happened, and I knew without looking back that whatever they were feeling, whatever they were thinking, none of it could reach me anymore, not in the same way, not after tonight, because the version of me they had known was no longer sitting at that table, waiting to be chosen, waiting to be defined by someone else's decisions. And as I stepped out into the hallway, the noise of the restaurant returning gradually, I realized that for the first time in a long time, the silence around me did not feel heavy. It felt clear, like something had finally been resolved, even if nothing about it had been easy. The hallway felt colder than the dining room, or maybe it was just the shift, the sudden absence of all those eyes, all that pressure, and I slowed down for a second as I walked past the glass doors, my reflection catching me off guard because I still looked the same dress, same expression, nothing on the outside showing what had just happened inside. I reached for the handle and pushed the door open, the quiet hum of the city at night slipping in immediately. Distant traffic, a faint breeze, the kind of ordinary sound that felt almost unreal after everything that had just unfolded. For a moment, I just stood there on the sidewalk, my hand still on the door, letting it close slowly behind me. And I did not rush. I did not check my phone. I did not look back. I just breathed, steady, controlled, like I had been doing all night. But then I heard it, the door opening again behind me, faster this time, and I did not need to turn around to know who it was. "Olivia," Daniel called out, and there was no hesitation in his voice now, just urgency, the kind that comes when something has already slipped too far to ignore. I closed my eyes for half a second, then opened them again and turned slowly, not surprised, not startled, just prepared. He stepped out onto the sidewalk, his tie slightly loosened now, his posture no longer as composed as it had been earlier. And for a second we just stood there, facing each other without the audience, without the table, without the noise. Just the two of us and everything that had not been said for months. "You cannot leave like that," he said, and I noticed how his voice dropped slightly. More personal now, less performative, like he was trying to reach something that was no longer there. I tilted my head just a fraction, studying him, and I realized that this was the version of him I used to respond to, the one who spoke quieter when things mattered, the one who expected me to meet him halfway, to soften, to reconsider. "I already did," I replied, the same words as before, but this time there was no one else around to hear them, no one else to interpret them, just him. He took a step closer, not too close, but enough to close some of the distance, and he ran a hand through his hair again, slower this time, like he was trying to find the right words instead of forcing them. "This is not how we handle things," he said, and I almost smiled again. That same, small, quiet reaction, because even now, he was framing it as something shared, something mutual, as if we were still operating within the same agreement. "We?" I repeated softly, and that one word seemed to stop him for a second, like it had not occurred to him that the meaning of that had changed. A car passed by, its headlights briefly washing over us before disappearing down the street. And in that moment of light, I saw his expression more clearly. Not confident, not controlled, just uncertain. "You should have told me what you were planning," he said. And there it was again, that shift, that expectation that I owed him. Access, explanation, transparency, even now. I looked at him carefully, not reacting immediately, letting the silence stretch just enough to make him feel it. And then I said, "You did not tell me either," and I did not need to specify what I meant because we both knew. He exhaled sharply, looking away for a second before looking back at me, and I could see it, the frustration, not loud, not explosive, but present, growing under the surface. "That is different," he said, and I let that hang in the air for a moment, because that sentence, more than anything else, explained everything. I nodded slowly, acknowledging it without agreeing, and I said, "Yes, it is." And I kept my voice calm, steady, because this was not an argument, not anymore. He took another step closer, his voice lowering even more. "We can still fix this." And I watched him as he said it, really watched, noticing how his eyes searched mine for something familiar, something responsive, something that used to be there. I shook my head gently, not dismissive, not harsh, just certain, and I said, "You are trying to fix something that already ended." And that seemed to land harder than anything else I had said, because this time there was no ambiguity, no room for interpretation. He went still for a second, completely still, and then he asked, "When?" And this time, it was not about the paperwork, not about the legal process. It was about something else, something deeper. I looked at him, holding his gaze, and I answered, "When you stop choosing this," and I let that settle, because it was not about one moment, one mistake, one decision. It was about a pattern, a shift, something that had happened gradually until it became permanent. He did not respond right away, and for the first time, I could see that he did not have a counter for that. No immediate defense, no quick explanation, just silence. The city noise continued around us, people passing by, conversations in the distance, life moving on in a way that felt almost disconnected from the moment we were standing in. "I did not think you would," he started, but did not finish, and I knew exactly what he meant. "I did not think you would leave. I did not think you would act. I did not think you would change the outcome." I nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and said, "I know." And that was the truth. I knew exactly what he had expected, and that was why this moment existed at all. He looked at me for a long second, then another, like he was trying to memorize something, or maybe understand it, and I realized that whatever he was seeing now, it was not the person he had taken for granted. It was someone else, someone he had not accounted for. I adjusted the strap of my bag on my shoulder, a small, grounding movement, and I took a step back, not dramatic, not rushed, just enough to create distance again. "Take care, Daniel," I said, and there was no anger in it, no bitterness, just a simple statement, and then I turned, not waiting for a response this time, not pausing, not giving him another opening. I walked down the sidewalk, my steps steady, the sound of my heels soft against the pavement, and I did not look back, not once, because I did not need to see his reaction, to know what it was. I did not need to confirm anything else, not anymore. And as I moved further away, the space between us becoming real in a way that could not be undone, I realized that for the first time in a long time, I was not walking away from something. I was walking towards something, even if I did not fully know what it was yet. And that felt different, lighter, like the weight I had been carrying without realizing it had finally been set down somewhere behind me, left in a place I no longer needed to return to. The night air felt different with every step I took. Not warmer, not colder, just clearer, like something inside me had finally stopped resisting what had already happened, and I kept walking without checking behind me, even when I heard the restaurant door open again in the distance, even when I felt that familiar pull to turn around, because I knew if I did, it would only reopen something I had already closed. The sidewalk stretched ahead under the soft glow of streetlights, and I focused on small things, the rhythm of my steps, the sound of a car passing by, the way the city moved around me without knowing anything about what had just unfolded a few feet away. My phone vibrated in my bag. Once, then again, but I did not reach for it immediately. I let it ring out, not because I did not know who it was, but because for the first time in a long time, I did not feel the need to respond right away. When I finally stopped at the corner, waiting for the light to change, I pulled it out slowly, and the screen lit up with his name, Daniel, repeated twice, then a message, then another, each one shorter than the last, like he was trying to find the right words and losing them as he typed. I looked at the screen for a second, then locked it again and slipped it back into my bag without opening anything, and that small decision felt bigger than it should have, like a quiet line I had finally drawn for myself. The light changed, and I crossed the street, my pace steady, my breathing even, and I realized I was not rushing to get anywhere. I was just moving forward, step by step, without needing to explain it to anyone. A taxi slowed down beside me, the driver glancing in my direction, and I raised my hand slightly, not hesitating this time, and when I slid into the back seat, the door closing with a soft, final sound, it felt like the first clear transition of the night. "Where to?" the driver asked, and for a second I paused, not because I did not know the address, but because saying it out loud felt different now, like I was choosing it for the first time instead of returning to it out of habit. I gave him the address, my voice calm, and as the car pulled away from the curb, I leaned back slightly, letting my head rest against the seat, watching the city lights blur past the window. My phone vibrated again, longer this time, and I reached for it, unlocking the screen, not to respond, just to see, and there it was, a series of messages, his words shifting from confusion to urgency to something closer to regret, but I did not open them fully. I just read the previews, enough to understand the pattern, enough to know that whatever he was saying now was coming too late. I turned the screen off again and placed the phone face down on my lap, my fingers resting lightly on it, not gripping, not tense, just there. The car moved through familiar streets, past places I had been 100 times before, restaurants, shops, intersections that once felt like part of a shared routine and now felt like something else entirely, something separate from him. I watched a couple walking along the sidewalk, laughing softly, their shoulders brushing as they moved, and for a brief second, something inside me shifted, not pain exactly, but recognition, like I was seeing something I had once believed in from the outside now. I closed my eyes for a moment, just a moment, and when I opened them again, the feeling had passed, replaced by something steadier, something quieter. The driver turned onto my street, slowing down as we approached the building, and I could see the familiar entrance ahead, the lights in the lobby still on, the same as always, unchanged, and that contrast struck me more than anything else, how something so significant could happen, and the world around it would continue exactly the same. When the car stopped, I paid the fare, my movements calm, practiced, and I stepped out onto the sidewalk, the night air wrapping around me again, softer now, less sharp than before. I stood there for a second, looking up at the building, at the windows, some lit, some dark, and I wondered briefly which one was mine now, not in terms of ownership, but in terms of what it meant, what it represented. My phone buzzed again in my hand, and this time I did not even look at it. I just held it loosely, then slipped it back into my bag as I walked toward the entrance. The lobby was quiet when I stepped inside, the soft hum of the overhead lights, the faint echo of my footsteps against the polished floor, and I moved toward the elevator without stopping, without hesitation. When the doors closed behind me, I caught my reflection again in the mirrored wall, the same image as before, but it did not feel the same anymore, and I realized that the change was not something anyone else could see. Not yet, maybe not ever, but it was there, clear, undeniable. The elevator began to move, the gentle motion almost imperceptible, and I watched the numbers light up one by one, each floor passing quietly, steadily, without interruption. I thought about the dinner, about the table, about the moment everything shifted, and instead of replaying it the way I thought I would, with anger or regret, I felt something else, something closer to closure. Not perfect, not clean, but real. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the hallway, the familiar carpet soft under my feet, the same faint scent of cleaning supplies in the air, and I walked toward my door, my steps unhurried, my mind clear. I stopped in front of it, reaching into my bag for my keys, the metal cool against my fingers, and for a second I paused, not out of doubt, not out of fear, just acknowledging the moment, the quiet weight of it. Then I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the space greeting me with a stillness that felt different now, not empty, not lonely, just mine, fully mine. And as I closed the door behind me, the soft click echoing gently in the quiet apartment, I understood that whatever had ended tonight had also created something else, something I was only just beginning to step into. And for the first time, I did not feel like I had lost everything. I felt like I had finally taken it back. The apartment stayed quiet after I closed the door, not the kind of silence that felt heavy or uncomfortable, but the kind that gave space. And I stood there for a moment, with my hand still resting on the handle, letting it settle in, letting everything from the night catch up to me without rushing it. I slipped off my shoes slowly and placed them neatly by the door, a small habit I had kept for years. And I noticed how automatic it felt, how normal, even after everything that had changed. I walked further inside, setting my bag down on the kitchen counter, the soft sound of it landing echoing slightly in the stillness. And I glanced around at the furniture, the walls, the details that had always been there but now felt different, like they belonged to me in a way they had not before. My phone buzzed again, more insistently this time, vibrating against the surface of the counter, and I looked at it without picking it up, watching his name appear over and over again, each call following the last without pause, and I could almost picture him, pacing somewhere, trying to regain control over something that was no longer his to control. I reached out and turned the phone over so the screen faced down, not rejecting it, just choosing not to engage. And that choice felt steady, grounded, like something I did not need to question. I moved to the living room and sat down slowly on the couch, leaning back, my hands resting loosely in my lap, and for the first time that night, I let my shoulders relax fully, the tension I had been carrying, without realizing it easing in a way that felt unfamiliar. My eyes drifted toward the window, the city lights reflecting faintly against the glass, and I thought about the dinner again, not in fragments, not in flashes, but as a whole, from the moment he stood up to the moment I walked away, and instead of replaying it with emotion, I saw it clearly, almost objectively, like I was finally able to step outside of it. I remembered the way he had looked at me when he realized, that shift in his expression, the moment control slipped and something else took its place, and I realized that for so long, I had been adjusting to him, to his expectations, to the way he shaped things, and tonight was the first time that dynamic had broken completely. The phone buzzed again, then stopped, then buzzed once more, shorter this time, and I knew the pattern, the shift from calling to messaging, from urgency to explanation, from control to reaction, and I let it continue without interruption. I stood up after a few minutes and walked toward the bedroom, the soft carpet under my feet grounding each step, and I paused at the doorway, looking inside at the space that had once been shared, at the bed, the dresser, the small details that had held two lives for so long. I stepped inside slowly, moving toward the closet, and I opened the door, the familiar arrangement of clothes hanging neatly, divided in a way that no longer made sense. I reached out and touched one of his jackets, the fabric smooth under my fingers, and for a second, a memory surfaced, not dramatic, not painful, just ordinary. A morning where everything had still felt stable, where I had believed in the routine we had built. I let the jacket fall back into place and closed the closet door gently, not with force, not with finality, just with intention. Back in the living room, I picked up my phone again, this time unlocking it, not to respond, but to read, and I opened one of his messages, just one, and it was exactly what I expected, a mix of confusion and urgency, questions layered with explanations, fragments of responsibility mixed with attempts to shift the narrative, and I read it once, slowly, then locked the screen again. I set the phone down on the table and walked to the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water, the simple act steadying, familiar, and I took a sip, the coolness grounding me further. I leaned lightly against the counter, looking out toward the living room, and I realized that I was not waiting for anything, not waiting for him to show up, not waiting for the next message, not waiting for a resolution that needed to be discussed. And that realization felt quiet but significant. The night continued outside, the city moving as it always did, and inside everything felt still but not empty, calm but not numb, just present. I walked back to the couch and sat down again, this time picking up a blanket and pulling it lightly over my legs, more out of habit than need, and I let my head rest back, closing my eyes for a moment, just a moment, allowing everything to settle without forcing it. When I opened them again, the room looked the same, but I did not feel the same, and that difference was subtle but undeniable. The phone remained silent now, no more calls, no more messages, and I did not check it again, because I did not need to. Not tonight. I sat there for a while longer, not thinking too far ahead, not trying to plan what came next, just allowing the present to exist without interruption. And in that quiet, I understood something clearly for the first time, that what had happened tonight was not just an ending, it was a shift, a reset of something that had been out of balance for longer than I had admitted. I stood up eventually and turned off the lights one by one, the apartment dimming gradually until only the soft glow from the window remained, and I walked toward the bedroom again, slower this time, not out of hesitation, but out of awareness. As I lay down, pulling the blanket over me, I felt the absence of everything that used to fill that space, but it did not feel like loss, not in the way I expected. It felt like space, like something open, something undefined but not empty. I closed my eyes, and for the first time in a long time, my mind did not race, did not replay, did not question. It simply rested, and in that stillness, I knew that whatever came next would not be shaped by what I had just left behind, but by what I chose to build moving forward. And that was something I had not felt in a very long time. Morning came quietly, without urgency, without interruption. Just a slow shift of light through the curtains that I noticed before I even opened my eyes. And for a moment I lay there still, not moving, not reaching for my phone, not checking the time, just letting myself exist in that space without expectation. The room felt different in daylight, softer, clearer, and when I finally sat up, the first thing I noticed was the silence, not empty, not heavy, just present. Like the apartment had settled into something new overnight. I swung my feet over the edge of the bed and stood, my movements slow, deliberate, as if I was adjusting to a rhythm that no longer depended on anyone else. My phone rested on the nightstand where I had left it, the screen dark, and I picked it up without hesitation this time, unlocking it, not because I felt pulled to, but because I was choosing to see. The notifications filled the screen, missed calls, message, names stacked one after another, Daniel at the top, then Margaret, then a few others I recognized from his side of the family, and I scrolled through them calmly, not opening anything yet, just observing the pattern, the volume, the urgency that had built overnight. I opened one message from him, just one, and read it slowly. The words more measured now, less frantic than the night before, but still trying to reach something that had already moved. He was asking to meet, to talk, to fix, repeating the same ideas in slightly different ways. And as I read it, I realized something clearly. This was no longer about understanding. It was about reaction, about him trying to regain something he had already lost. I locked the screen again and placed the phone back down, not responding, not deleting, just leaving it there. Because silence in that moment was not avoidance, it was a decision. I moved to the kitchen and started the coffee maker, the familiar sound filling the space, grounding, ordinary. And I leaned lightly against the counter as it brewed, watching the steam rise, letting the morning settle in without rushing ahead of it. The sunlight reached further into the room now, catching the edges of the furniture, and I realized how different everything looked in daylight compared to the night before, less dramatic, more real, and that felt right, because what had happened was not dramatic in the way people might expect. It was precise, intentional, and now it was simply part of reality. I poured the coffee into a mug and carried it to the living room, sitting down in the same spot as the night before. But this time, the space did not feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning, quiet, unannounced, but unmistakable. My phone buzzed once more on the table, a new message, and I glanced at it briefly, not reaching for it immediately, just acknowledging it, then taking a sip of coffee before picking it up again. This time, it was not from Daniel, it was from my lawyer, a short, clear message confirming that everything had been processed, that the filings were complete, that the next steps would follow the timeline we had already discussed. And I read it twice, not because I did not understand it, but because seeing it written out made it fully real in a way nothing else had yet. I replied with a simple confirmation, nothing more, and placed the phone back down, my hand resting on the table for a second longer than necessary, feeling the surface under my fingertips, steady, solid. I stood up after finishing my coffee and walked through the apartment again, not searching for anything, just moving, noticing small details, the way the light hit the wall, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the absence of anything out of place, and I realized that nothing in the physical space had changed overnight, but everything about how I experienced it had. I opened the window slightly, letting in fresh air, and the sound of the city drifted in, distant but constant, reminding me that life outside had continued exactly the same, even as mine had shifted completely. I walked back to the bedroom and opened the closet again, looking at it with a different perspective now, not as something shared, but as something I needed to redefine, and I reached for a hanger, sliding one of his jackets off and setting it aside, not abruptly, not emotionally, just with intention, the first of many small decisions that would follow. My phone buzzed again from the other room, and this time I did not go to it right away. I stayed where I was, continuing what I had started, because not every moment required an immediate response anymore. When I did return to the living room, I picked up the phone and saw another message from Daniel, shorter this time, more direct, asking if we could meet that afternoon, and I looked at it for a long second, considering not the words themselves, but what they represented. I sat down again, holding the phone loosely in my hand, and for the first time since everything had happened, I thought about what I wanted, not what needed to be resolved, not what was expected, but what I actually chose moving forward. I typed a response slowly, not rushed, not emotional, just clear, and when I finished, I read it once, making sure it said exactly what I meant, nothing more, nothing less. Then I pressed send and set the phone down. The message was simple, a time, a place, neutral, controlled, not an invitation, not a negotiation, just a step. I leaned back against the couch, exhaling softly, and for a moment I let myself sit with that. The shift from reaction to direction, from responding to deciding, and it felt steady, like something that would hold. Outside, the day continued to unfold, people moving, cars passing, the world unchanged, and inside, everything felt aligned in a way I had not experienced before, not because it was easy, not because it was resolved, but because it was clear. I looked around the room one more time, not searching, not questioning, just observing, and I understood that whatever came next would not be about returning to what was. It would be about moving forward from what had already been decided, and this time, that direction was mine to choose. The cafe was quieter than I expected when I walked in that afternoon, not empty, but calm, the low hum of conversations blending into the background, the soft clink of cups and plates, creating a rhythm that felt almost steadying, and I paused for a moment near the entrance, letting my eyes adjust, letting myself take in the space before stepping further inside. Daniel was already there, sitting at a table near the window, his posture slightly forward, his hands resting on the table as if he had been waiting longer than he wanted to admit, and when he saw me, he stood up immediately, too quickly, like he had been watching the door the entire time. I walked toward him at a steady pace, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving forward, and when I reached the table, I nodded once in acknowledgement before sitting down across from him, the chair sliding softly against the floor. "Thank you for coming," he said, his voice controlled, but there was something under it, something less certain than before, and I met his gaze briefly, then glanced at the menu without opening it, just giving myself a moment to settle. "You asked to meet?" I replied simply, and I could see the shift in his expression, the way he registered the difference in tone, not cold, not distant, just clear. A server approached, asking if we wanted anything to drink, and Daniel answered quickly, ordering for himself, then looking at me as if expecting me to follow, and I placed my own order calmly, my voice steady, independent, and that small moment seemed to underline everything that had changed. When the server walked away, the space between us felt more defined than it had ever been, not uncomfortable, just unmistakable, like a boundary that neither of us needed to explain out loud. Daniel leaned forward slightly, his hands clasping together, then separating again, a subtle movement that betrayed the tension he was trying to contain. "I read everything again," he said, and I nodded once, acknowledging that without asking for details, because I already knew what he had found, what he had understood. "There are things in there I did not realize," he continued, and I noticed how careful he was choosing his words now, how deliberate, like he was trying to regain footing in a conversation he no longer controlled. I folded my hands lightly on the table, listening, not interrupting, not guiding, just letting him speak. "You changed the structure months ago," he said, and I met his eyes at that, holding the gaze for a second longer than necessary, and he exhaled quietly, as if that confirmed what he had suspected. "You moved the ownership," he added, and I nodded again, once, not explaining, not elaborating, just confirming. There was a pause then, longer this time, And I could see him processing not just the legal outcome, but the timeline, the realization that this had not been a reaction, but a decision made long before the dinner. "Why did you not tell me?" he asked finally, and there was something different in his voice now, less defensive, more direct, and I considered the question carefully before answering. "Because I needed to understand what you were going to choose," I said, my tone even, not accusatory, just honest, and he looked down at the table for a moment, his fingers tracing the edge of his cup as if grounding himself. "And you decided I would not," he said, and I shook my head slightly. "You showed me," I replied, and that seemed to land in a way that left no room for argument. The drinks arrived then, the server placing them gently on the table, breaking the moment just enough to allow both of us to breathe, to reset, and when she left, Daniel picked up his cup but did not drink, just held it, his gaze fixed on the surface. "This does not have to go this far," he said after a moment, and I recognized the shift, the attempt to negotiate, to redefine the situation into something manageable. I took a small sip of my drink before answering, not rushing, letting the pause stretch naturally. "It already has," I said, and I set the cup back down, my hands steady, my movements unforced. He leaned back slightly, exhaling, and for a second, he looked at me like he was trying to reconcile the person in front of him with the one he thought he knew, and I could see it clearly, that gap, that difference, and I realized that this conversation was not about changing anything anymore. It was about understanding what had already changed. "What do you want now?" he asked. And the question felt different from the others, less about control, more about clarity, and I took a moment before answering, not because I was unsure, but because I wanted the words to be precise. "I want everything to move forward exactly as it is," I said. And I watched as he absorbed that, as he understood that there was no adjustment, no reconsideration, no hidden flexibility behind it. "There has to be something we can work out," he said. And this time there was a hint of urgency again, but it was softer, less forceful, like he already knew the answer. I shook my head gently. "There is nothing left to negotiate," I replied, and I held his gaze as I said it. Not challenging, not harsh, just certain. The cafe continued around us, people talking, moving, living their own lives, and the normalcy of it contrasted sharply with the quiet finality of our conversation. Daniel looked down again, then back up, and for a moment he did not speak, just sat there, processing, and I could see it, the acceptance starting to take shape, not fully, not completely, but enough. "I did not think it would end like this," he said quietly, and I nodded once, understanding the sentiment without sharing it. "It did not end tonight," I said, and I let that settle. It ended when it stopped being mutual, and that seemed to shift something in him. Not dramatically, but enough to change the way he held himself, the way he looked at me. He did not respond immediately, and for the first time in the conversation, the silence did not feel like tension. It felt like acknowledgement, like something had finally been understood. I finished my drink slowly, placing the cup back on the table with a soft sound, and I reached for my bag, not abruptly, not as an escape, just as the natural next step. Daniel watched the movement, then looked back at me, and there was nothing left in his expression that suggested he could change what had already been decided. "Take care, Olivia," he said, and I nodded once, a small acknowledgement, and I stood up from the table, the chair sliding back quietly. I did not rush. I did not hesitate. I simply turned and walked toward the exit, the afternoon light filtering through the glass doors ahead, steady, clear, and as I stepped outside, the air felt the same as before, the city unchanged, but everything about how I moved through it felt different, aligned, like I was no longer adjusting to something that no longer existed, but stepping fully into something that was entirely my own. Life did not suddenly become perfect after that day, and I think that is the part no one really talks about. How healing does not arrive all at once, how peace is not loud or dramatic, but quiet and steady, like the way the sunlight falls across my living room now in the mornings, or how I make my coffee without checking my phone, or how I can sit in my own space without feeling like I am waiting for something to go wrong. The weeks that followed were not easy. There were moments when memories came back without warning. Small things, a song, a restaurant, a Provichny routine that no longer existed, and for a second, it would feel like I was standing in two timelines at once, the life I thought I had and the one I was now building. But the difference was, I no longer felt lost between them. I started noticing things about myself that I had ignored for years, the way I had adjusted, compromised, stayed quiet in moments when something inside me had already known the truth. And I began to understand that what happened to me was not just about betrayal, it was about the slow erosion of my own voice, something I had allowed without realizing it. And that realization did not come with anger, it came with clarity, the kind that stays, the kind that does not shake easily. I reorganized my home, not all at once, just piece by piece, moving things, removing others, creating a space that reflected who I was now, not who I had been in a relationship that no longer existed. And with every small change, I felt something settle inside me, like I was reclaiming not just the space, but myself. There were conversations too, with my lawyer, with people who needed to be informed, with family members who reached out in ways I did not expect, some supportive, some uncertain, but for the first time, I did not feel the need to explain myself beyond what was necessary. I did not feel the need to justify my decisions, and that alone felt like a kind of freedom I had not experienced before. I learned something through all of this that I wish I had understood earlier, that boundaries are not something you set when things fall apart. They are something you build when things are still quiet, when the first signs appear, when your intuition speaks softly instead of loudly. Because the truth is, your intuition always knows. It does not shout, it does not force, it simply shows you, again and again, until you decide whether to listen or not. And if there is one thing I would say to anyone listening right now, it is this: do not ignore that voice. Do not convince yourself that something is normal when it does not feel right, because the cost of ignoring it is not just the situation itself. It is the part of you that slowly learns to doubt your own awareness. Protect your emotional space the same way you would protect your physical safety. Ask questions when something feels off. Pay attention to patterns, not just words, and never hand over control of your financial or personal independence without understanding exactly what it means, because love should never require you to become smaller, quieter, or less aware of yourself. I also learned that forgiveness does not always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it simply means releasing the need to carry something that no longer belongs to you, and that kind of forgiveness is not for them. It is for you. It is how you move forward without dragging the past behind you. There were nights when I questioned everything, when I wondered if I had overreacted, if I could have handled things differently, but those moments passed more quickly each time, replaced by something steadier, something that reminded me that I had not acted out of impulse. I had acted out of awareness, out of a quiet understanding that had taken months to fully form. And over time, that understanding turned into trust, not in someone else, but in myself, in my ability to see clearly, to decide, to walk away when something no longer aligned with who I am. If you are listening to this, and you are in a place where something feels wrong but you cannot fully explain it yet, I want you to know that you are not imagining it, you are not overthinking, you are paying attention. And that is something you should never silence. Take your time, gather your clarity, protect your peace, and remember that choosing yourself is not selfish, it is necessary. There is also something I came to believe more deeply through all of this, that whether you call it intuition, or faith, or something greater guiding you, there is a quiet presence that nudges you toward truth, toward alignment, toward the life you are meant to live. And when you listen to it, even when it is difficult, even when it requires letting go, it leads you somewhere better, somewhere more honest. I am not saying the journey is easy, it is not, but it is worth it, every step of it, because on the other side of that clarity, there is a version of you that is no longer waiting to be chosen, no longer defined by someone else's decisions, but fully present, fully aware, and fully your own. Thank you for being here, for listening, for holding space for a story like mine, because I know how isolating these experiences can feel, and if even a small part of this made you feel less alone, then that means more than I can put into words. If this story stayed with you, you can share your thoughts, your experiences, or simply where you are in your journey, because sometimes just being heard is the first step toward healing. And if you want to follow more stories like this, you can subscribe and stay connected, not for me, but for yourself, for the reminder that you are not the only one walking through something like this. My name is Olivia Carter. I am 32 years old, and the lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never ignore the quiet truth inside you, because it will always lead you back to yourself.